In the small, tidy apartment, the air always seemed to be holding its breath. It wasn't a bad silence, not really. It was the kind of quiet that comes with order, with a life planned out down to the last minute. The boy lived in this quiet, moving through it like a ghost. He was 16, and to the world, and more importantly to his parents, he was the perfect son. His grades were excellent, his clothes were neat, and his future was a straight, clean line leading to a scholarship in engineering. Every evening the scene was the same. The smell of his mother's cooking fragrant spices and sizzling vegetables would fill the small space. His father would be in his armchair, a heavy engineering textbook open on his lap, the low hum of the reading lamp the only sound besides the soft turning of a page. The boy would sit at the small table in the kitchen, his math problems spread out before him. He would solve them, his pencil scratching quietly, and he would feel nothing. It was just a task, like breathing. He was good at it, but it didn't make him feel alive. He was a reflection of the hopes his parents carried with them when they had moved to this country, hopes built on hard work and practical dreams. Art, they believed, was a luxury you couldn't afford. It was a leaky faucet in the house of life, a beautiful but useless thing that would eventually drain you dry. But the boy had a secret, a world he kept hidden behind the quiet, obedient face they saw every day. His secret lived in the dusty, forgotten storage room of his high school, behind stacks of old, yellowing textbooks and broken gym equipment. In the middle of that cluttered space, like a sleeping giant, sat an old upright piano. Its wood was chipped, its ivory keys were yellowed with age, and one of its pedals was stuck. To everyone else it was just another piece of junk. To him it was everything. He had found it by accident one afternoon, trying to escape the noise of the crowded hallways. He had pushed the door open, expecting to find a closet, but instead he found the piano. He had run a finger over the keys, not really knowing what he was doing, and a single, dusty note had echoed in the silence. That note had changed everything. It was like a voice speaking a language he didn't know he understood. From that day on, the storage room became his sanctuary. He would sneak in after school, telling his parents he was at a math club or a study group. He would close the door, and the world of expectations and silent dinners would disappear. It was just him and the piano. He never had a lesson. He couldn't afford them, and he couldn't ask. So he taught himself. He would listen to songs on the radio, his head cocked to the side, his fingers tapping out rhythms on his legs under the dinner table. He would find videos online, turning the volume all the way down and just watching the dancer's fingers fly across the keys, memorizing the patterns. In the beginning, his own fingers were clumsy, tripping over each other. But he was patient. He would spend hours, his back aching, working on a single chord until it sounded right. And slowly, a new kind of sound began to emerge from that old, broken piano. It wasn't the music from the radio, and it wasn't the music from the videos. It was his. It was full of all the things he couldn't say. It was the loneliness he felt sitting at the kitchen table, the quiet frustration of being a ghost in his own life, the secret joy he felt when a melody finally came together. The music was his diary, a secret language written in notes and chords that only he and the dusty piano could understand. When he played, he wasn't a quiet, obedient boy anymore. He was powerful. He was a storyteller. He was free. His hands, which seemed so awkward holding a pencil, became graceful and strong on the keys. He could lose himself for hours, the world outside the storage room door fading away until all that existed was the music thrumming through him. A vibrant, living thing. The lie was a heavy stone in his pocket. But the music was worth it. He became an expert at being invisible. At school, he was quiet, blending into the background. At home, he was the model son. But inside, he was a composer, a pianist, an artist. He carried the melodies in his head all day, like a secret soundtrack to his life. He would be in the middle of a physics lecture, and a new tune would start to form in his mind, a cascade of notes that he couldn't wait to try out. The risk made it all the more thrilling. Every time he closed the storage room door, his heart would beat a little faster. Every time he heard footsteps in the hallway, he would freeze, his hands hovering over the keys, terrified of being discovered. This double life was exhausting, but it was the only way he could survive. The music wasn't just a hobby. It was as essential to him as breathing. It was the one place where he didn't have to be perfect. He could make mistakes, he could be messy, he could be loud. The piano didn't care about his grades or his future plans. It only cared about the music he brought to it. Then, one evening, everything came crashing down. He had been careless. He had printed out a piece of sheet music for a particularly complex melody he'd been working on, a swirling, emotional piece that felt like a storm in his chest. He had meant to take it out of his backpack, but he had forgotten. His father, who usually never went through his things, was looking for a permission slip for a school field trip. The boy sat at the kitchen table, his heart suddenly pounding for a reason that had nothing to do with math. He watched as his father unzipped his backpack, his movements methodical and precise. He pulled out books, folders, and then his hand stopped. He held up the crumpled piece of paper. The boy's blood ran cold. The silence in the apartment, which was usually so familiar, suddenly felt sharp and dangerous. His father looked at the paper, then at him. His face didn't change at first, but his eyes grew hard. He didn't shout. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and flat, a sound far more terrifying than any yell. "What is this?" he asked, holding up the paper. The boy couldn't speak. His throat felt like it was closing up. It's nothing," he finally managed to whisper. But it was too late. His father looked at the notes on the page, the black dots and lines that meant nothing to him but represented everything the boy was hiding. "I told you," his father said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I told you about your cousin. How he threw his life away for this foolishness. Music is a dream, and dreams break. They leave you with nothing." He walked over to the table and placed the paper down in front of the boy. "This is a distraction. It is a gift that will bring you nothing but heartache. Hide it, forget it. Your future is in numbers, not in notes." The words hit the boy like a physical blow. He saw the fear in his father's eyes, a deep-seated fear of poverty and failure, and he understood. But understanding didn't stop the hollow ache that spread through his chest. His father turned and walked back to his armchair, picking up his textbook as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The boy sat at the table, staring at the sheet music, the beautiful, secret language now looking like evidence of a crime. The silence in the apartment was no longer just quiet. It was a wall, a command. And for the first time, he felt the true weight of it, a weight that threatened to crush the music right out of him. The days that followed were like walking through mud. The boy went to school, he came home, he sat at the kitchen table and did his work. But the color had drained out of everything. The silence in the apartment, which he had once found peaceful, now felt like a wall, pressing in on him. His father's words echoed in his head every time he picked up a pencil. "Your future is in numbers, not in notes." He tried to obey. He really did. He would stare at his physics equations, trying to force the numbers to make sense, to feel the same thrill he felt when a melody came together. But they were just shapes on a page. The music, however, was still inside him. It didn't just disappear. It was like a caged bird fluttering against his ribs, desperate to get out. He would find himself tapping out complex rhythms on his thigh under the dinner table, a secret beat in a room of quiet chewing. He would hum harmonies so softly they were almost just a breath, his own private soundtrack to a life that felt like it was happening to someone else. His mother noticed his distraction once. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked, her hand on his forehead. He just nodded, unable to explain that a part of him was sick, a part that was slowly starving. He couldn't go back to the school storage room. The risk was too great. He was sure his father would find some way to check, some way to know. So he endured. The music in his head grew louder, more insistent. It was in the rumble of the school bus, in the dripping of a leaky faucet, in the rhythm of his own footsteps. He felt like he was going crazy. He was a vessel filled to the brim with something beautiful and powerful, and the lid was screwed on tight. One Saturday, a month after the confrontation, he was wandering the streets just trying to escape the suffocating quiet of his apartment. He ended up in a part of town he didn't know well, and he saw a large brick building, the local community center. Out of a desperate, aimless curiosity, he went inside. The place was bustling with activity kids in a basketball clinic, a yoga class in session, the smell of chlorine from the swimming pool. And then he saw it. Through a set of double doors at the end of a long hallway, there was an auditorium. The doors were slightly ajar. He pushed one open and peeked inside. The auditorium was empty, a cavern of red velvet seats and shadowy balconies. And on the stage, under a single ghost light, sat a grand piano. It was sleek and black, a perfect gleaming monster. It looked 1,000 times more intimidating and 1,000 times more beautiful than the dusty old upright at school Dot and Idea. Wild and reckless began to form in his mind. He went to the main desk and asked if they needed any volunteers. A bored teenager behind the desk handed him a form. "We always need help," she said, "especially cleaning up on weekends." He filled it out, lying about his age, and signed up for every Saturday and Sunday afternoon. His lie to his parents was easy. "It's a new study group," he said, "for advanced placement. It's at the library." They were pleased, their faces relaxing back into their comfortable expressions of pride. The first Saturday, his heart was hammering against his ribs as he pushed a cleaning cart into the empty auditorium. He locked the doors behind him, his hands shaking. He didn't touch the piano at first. He just swept the floors, his eyes fixed on it the entire time. Finally, when he couldn't stand it anymore, he walked up the steps onto the stage. He ran a hand over the smooth, cool wood of the lid. He lifted it, revealing the pristine black and white keys. They seemed to glow in the dim light. He sat down on the bench, the plush velvet a stark contrast to the hard wooden stool at school. He took a deep breath and placed his fingers on the keys. The first note that rang out was so clear, so pure, that it made him jump. The sound filled the entire auditorium, bouncing off the walls and ceiling. It was a living thing. He started to play, hesitantly at first, the melodies that had been trapped inside him for weeks pouring out. It was like a dam had broken. He played with a fury and a desperation he had never felt before. He wasn't just playing notes. He was pouring all his loneliness, his frustration, his secret joy, and his aching need into the music. The empty auditorium was his cathedral, and the piano was his voice. He played for what felt like hours, losing all track of time until his fingers were sore and his arms ached. When he finally stopped, the silence that rushed back in was different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of his apartment. It was a peaceful, reverent silence, the kind that comes after a storm. He felt drained, but also more alive than he had in weeks. This became his new ritual. Every weekend, he would tell his parents he was at the library and he would go to the community center to clean. He would lock himself in the auditorium and play until the sun went down. He was completely alone, or so he thought. One afternoon, in the middle of a particularly emotional piece, he felt a presence. He stopped abruptly, his head snapping up. Standing in the doorway at the back of the auditorium was an old man in a janitor's uniform. He had a kind, wrinkled face and a head of white hair. The boy's blood ran cold. He was caught. He braced himself for the shouting, the accusations, the inevitable call to his parents. But the old man just stood there, listening. When the last echo of the note faded away, he walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps soft on the carpet. He didn't say anything at first. He just climbed the steps onto the stage and stood beside the piano. "You've got a lot of soul in there, son," the old man said, his voice raspy but gentle. "A whole lot of soul?" The boy just stared at him, speechless. "Don't worry," the man said with a small smile. "Your secret's safe with me." The old man's name was Mr. Abernathy, and he was the center's head custodian. He became the boy's silent accomplice. He would make sure the auditorium was left unlocked for him. And he would sometimes sit in the very last row, a shadowy figure in the dark, listening. Mr. Abernathy, it turned out, had been a jazz pianist in his youth, playing in smoky clubs long before the boy was born. He couldn't teach him theory or technique, but he taught him something far more important. He taught him about feeling. "Don't just play the notes," he would tell him. "Tell the story. Why is that note sad? Why is that one angry? Make the piano talk? He started leaving old, dog-eared jazz lead sheets on the piano bench for the boy to find songs by Duke Ellington and Thelonious Monk. The boy devoured them, his world expanding beyond the melodies in his own head. He learned about improvisation, about taking a simple melody and turning it inside out, making it his own. Under Mr. Abernethy's quiet guidance, his music began to change. It became more complex, more nuanced, more honest. He wasn't just a kid playing the piano anymore. He was becoming a musician. The empty auditorium was no longer just a hiding place. It was a concert hall, and the old janitor in the back row was his audience of one, a single, appreciative soul who understood the language he was speaking. It was a secret world, built on trust and a shared love of music, and in that world, the boy was finally free. The weekends became the anchor of his life. The week was a gray, colorless stretch of time he had to endure, a series of hours spent sitting in classrooms and at the kitchen table, pretending to be a boy he didn't feel like anymore. But Saturdays and Sundays were in vibrant color. They were the smell of old wood and polish in the community center, the feel of the plush velvet bench under his fingers, and the sound of his own music filling the empty auditorium. Mr. Abernethy had become a constant, quiet presence. He never interrupted, never gave instructions while the boy was playing. He would just appear, leaning against the back wall, his silhouette a small, dark shape in the vast, empty space. Afterward, he would sometimes come up and share a small piece of wisdom. "You're thinking too much with your fingers," he might say, his raspy voice gentle. "Think with your heart. Let the heart tell the fingers what to do." He would leave behind old, brittle sheet music, the corners worn soft with use. The boy learned about blue notes and syncopation, about the space between the notes being just as important as the notes themselves. His music, once a private cry of loneliness, was now becoming a conversation. It had questions and answers, moments of joy and flashes of sorrow. It was the truest part of him. And for a few hours each weekend, it was free one Sunday. As the boy was packing up his cleaning cart, his muscles pleasantly sore and his mind still buzzing with the chords of a new piece he was working on, Mr. Abernethy approached him. He wasn't holding a piece of music this time. He held a brightly colored flyer, crumpled at the edges as if he'd been carrying it around for a while. "Saw this on the board out front," the old man said, holding it out. The boy took it. The words were in big, bold letters: "The Midwest Starlight Competition. A search for the region's best young musicians." His heart gave a little lurch, a strange mix of excitement and immediate, sharp fear. He scanned the page. It was a formal event, held in a real concert hall in the city. There would be judges, an audience. The grand prize made his hands tremble. It wasn't just money. It was a full 4-year scholarship to the Oberlin Conservatory of Music. Oberlin, he had heard of it. It was one of the best music schools in the country, a place people from all over the world dreamed of going. It felt like looking at a poster for a trip to the moon. It was a wonderful, impossible dream. "You should think about it," Mr. Abernethy said, his eyes twinkling in the dim light of the auditorium. The boy's first instinct was to laugh it off. "Me? No, I couldn't," he said, shaking his head and trying to hand the flyer back. "I just play for fun." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Mr. Abernethy didn't take the flyer. "A gift like yours isn't for fun, son," he said, his tone turning serious. "It's a responsibility. You think that music just belongs to you? You think it's happy being locked up in this empty room every weekend? It's like having a beautiful bird and keeping it in a cage? Sure, it's safe, but it can't sing the way it's meant to sing." The boy looked down at the flyer, at the picture of the grand piano on the stage under bright spotlights. All he could see was a crowd of faces, all of them staring at him. He imagined his fingers fumbling, the notes coming out wrong, the silence of the audience thick with disappointment. The thought was paralyzing. But even deeper than the stage fright was a cold, heavy dread, his parents. He could just imagine their faces if they found out. The betrayal, the shame. He could hear his father's voice, sharp and final. We left everything behind so you could have a stable future, and you throw it away for this, for a performance? I can't, the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. My parents, they wouldn't understand. They'd never let me. He thought of the lie he was already living, the study group at the library that was actually his secret concert. This new lie would be 100 times bigger. It would be a mountain built on top of a hill of deception. Mr. Abernethy put a wrinkled hand on his shoulder. It was a light touch, but it felt solid, grounding. Sometimes the people who love us the most can't see the path we're supposed to walk, he said softly. They see a safe, paved road, and they want us to stay on it because they're scared of the woods. But sometimes what you're meant to find is in those woods. You just have to be brave enough to take the first step. He looked the boy straight in the eye. This isn't just about winning a competition. It's about finding out if your music can live outside of this room. It's about finding out if you can live outside of this room. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the boy standing alone on the stage. The crumpled flyer feeling heavy as a stone in his hand. That night the boy couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, the flyer hidden under his mattress, its presence like a secret heartbeat. The two worlds inside his head were at war. In one world, he saw his father's tired face, his mother's hopeful smile. He saw the engineering degree, the stable job, the quiet, predictable life they had sacrificed so much to give him. In that world, entering the competition was an act of supreme selfishness, a betrayal of their love and their dreams. It was the foolish path of his cousin, the one whose name was never spoken but whose story served as a constant warning. But in the other world, he was on that stage. He was playing, and the music wasn't just echoing in an empty auditorium. It was washing over a crowd of people. He saw faces not judging him but feeling what he was feeling. He saw a life where he didn't have to hide, where the thing that made him feel alive was the very thing he built his life upon. The scholarship wasn't just a prize. It was a key. It was a way to have a future, a secure future, but one that was actually his. It was a bridge between his parents' world and his own. The next few days were a blur of inner turmoil. He would look at his parents across the dinner table, a knot of guilt tightening in his stomach. His father would ask about his schoolwork, and he would answer, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He felt like a fraud. The lie he was already living felt heavy enough. This new one felt impossible. But every time he decided to forget the competition, to tear up the flyer and be done with it, the music would call to him. He would be in the middle of a math class, and a melody he was working on would start playing in his head, so clear and so beautiful. He would remember the feeling of his fingers on the keys, the way the sound filled him up and made him feel whole. He thought about what Mr. Abernethy had said about the bird in the cage. Was that what he was doing? Was he letting his own fear, and his fear of his parents' disappointment, suffocate the one true thing he had? Finally, on a Thursday evening, he went to the community center. He didn't have a cleaning shift, but he just needed to be near the piano. The auditorium was dark and locked, but he could see the gleaming shape of the piano on the stage through the small window in the door. He stood there for a long time, just looking at it. He thought about all the secrets it held, all the emotions he had poured into it. He realized then that he couldn't let it be just a secret. It was too big, too important. It had to be heard. He had to find out if it was real, or if it was just a fantasy he had created in an empty room. The decision didn't feel like a choice anymore. It felt like a necessity. The next evening he sat at the dinner table, his heart pounding so hard he was sure his parents could hear it. He had practiced what he was going to say over and over until the words sounded almost natural. "There's a special symposium this weekend," he began, trying to keep his voice steady, "for students who are interested in top engineering programs. It's at the university. They have workshops and lectures, and you can meet professors." He watched his parents' faces as he spoke. His mother's eyes lit up. "A symposium? That's wonderful," she said, a proud smile spreading across her face. His father looked up from his plate, his expression thoughtful. "Which university?" he asked. The boy named the one he had looked up online, the one that was far enough away to make the story believable. "That's a very good school, his father said, a rare note of approval in his voice. "This is a good opportunity. You should learn all you can." The pride in their voices was like a physical weight on his chest. He felt a surge of guilt so sharp it almost took his breath away. He was using their love for him, their dreams for his future, to build a lie that went against everything they believed in. He just nodded, unable to speak, and stared down at his plate. That night, alone in his room, he filled out the application for the Midwest Starlight competition. His hands shook as he wrote his name, his address, his age. For the piece to be performed, he wrote the title of the composition he had been working on. The one that felt the most like him, a swirling mix of jazz and classical that he had created from the fragments of his soul. He folded the application, put it in an envelope, and walked to the mailbox at the corner of his street. The streetlight cast a long, lonely shadow as he dropped the letter into the slot. It made a soft final sound as it fell. It was done. There was no turning back. He stood there for a moment, the cool night air on his face, feeling a terrifying mix of fear and exhilaration. He had just stepped off the safe, paved road and into the woods. He had no idea what was in there, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was truly walking. The morning of the competition felt unreal. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and his mother made his favorite breakfast. It all felt painfully normal, like a scene from a play where he was the only one who knew the tragic ending. He moved through the morning like a robot, his body on autopilot, while his mind was a chaotic storm of fear and excitement. His backpack felt heavier than usual, not with textbooks, but with the single sheet music for his own composition and the crushing weight of his lies. "Have a great time at the symposium," his father said at the door, his hand on the boy's shoulder. There was such genuine pride in his voice, such trust, that it felt like a physical blow. The boy just nodded, unable to meet his eyes, and mumbled a quiet, "I will." The lie was a living thing now, sitting between them at the breakfast table, walking with him to the door, and waving goodbye with his own hand. The bus ride to the city was long. He watched his neighborhood, his streets, his whole world fade away in the distance. With every mile he felt a little more free and a little more terrified. He was heading towards a dream, but he was leaving his whole life behind to do it. The concert hall was even more intimidating than he had imagined. It was a huge old building with marble floors and towering ceilings. Inside, the auditorium was a cavern of deep red velvet and polished gold. The stage was vast, and in the center, under a single bright spotlight, sat a grand piano that looked like it belonged to a king. Backstage was a whirlwind of nervous energy. Other contestants, some with violins, some with flutes, were pacing or practicing quietly. Their parents were there, fussing with their collars, giving them last-minute words of encouragement. He was completely alone. He found a small corner and just sat there, his hands clammy, his heart beating a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt like an imposter, a kid who had wandered into a world where he didn't belong when his name was called. It felt like a jolt of electricity. He walked out onto the stage, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. The heat from the spotlights was intense. He looked out, and the crowd was just a blur of faces, a sea of shadows stretching out into the darkness. He could feel the eyes of the 3 judges at their table in the front row, their expressions serious and unreadable. He sat down at the piano, the bench smooth and cold beneath him. He placed his shaking fingers on the keys. He took a deep breath, trying to remember Mr. Abernethy's advice, trying to think with his heart. But all he could think about was the lie, the faces of his parents, the hundreds of people watching. He began to play. The notes came out, but they were stiff, mechanical, and lifeless. It was the sound of fear. His fingers, which usually felt so connected to the music, felt like foreign objects. He was messing up. He could feel it. The melody was stumbling, the rhythm was off. A wave of panic washed over him, cold and sharp. He was going to fail. He was going to be exposed as a fraud, right here on this stage. He was about to stop, to just get up and run away in shame. But then he closed his eyes. He blocked out the lights, the judges, the crowd. He shut out the memory of his father's disappointed face and the image of his mother's proud smile. He imagined himself back in his sanctuary, the empty auditorium at the community center. He pictured the dim light, the smell of dust, and the quiet, reassuring presence of Mr. Abernethy in the back row. He was just a boy and a piano, telling a story to a friend. He took another breath, this one deeper and slower. He started again. This time, something was different. The first note that rang out wasn't hesitant. It was clear and strong, full of purpose. And the notes that followed were no longer just notes. They were a confession. He poured all of it into the music. The loneliness of the quiet apartment, the frustration of the unsolvable math problems, the secret joy of finding a new melody, the desperate need to be heard. The music swelled, becoming a storm of complex chords and soaring melodies. It was angry and sad, then hopeful and beautiful. It was the sound of a soul set free. He wasn't just playing the piano anymore. He was having a conversation with it, and the whole room was listening. When he played the final chord, he let it hang in the air, its echo slowly fading into a profound, stunned silence. The silence lasted for what felt like an eternity. Then, a single person began to clap. Quickly, it was joined by another and another, until the entire auditorium erupted in a roar of applause. It was so loud it was overwhelming. People were on their feet. He saw the judges looking at each other, their faces no longer serious but filled with awe. He had done it. He had shocked them. He stood up on shaky legs and bowed, the sound of the applause washing over him like a wave. For the first time all day he wasn't scared. He was just proud. The rest of the competition was a blur. He watched other talented musicians perform, but he was floating in a daze. When they announced the winners and his name was called for first place, it felt like a dream. He walked back onto the stage to accept the scholarship certificate, the applause even louder this time. He had won. He had actually won. The lie, it seemed, had been worth it. He had a future, a real future, doing the one thing he loved. As he walked off stage, clutching the certificate, his heart was soaring. He couldn't wait to find a phone to call Mr. Abernethy. He turned a corner into the lobby, and his heart stopped. There, standing by the entrance, were his parents. His mother had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. And his father's face was a mask of cold, hard fury. The world came crashing down around him. A well-meaning neighbor, who had seen the flyer for the competition and assumed his parents would be there to support him, had told them where he really was. The symposium was over. The ride home was the most suffocating experience of his life. No one spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the swish of the windshield wipers. The certificate felt like a piece of burning trash in his hands. He had expected shouting, screaming, anything but this terrible, heavy silence. Finally, when they were just a few blocks from home, his father spoke. His voice was low and flat, devoid of any warmth. "You have shamed us," he said, his eyes fixed on the road. "You lied to us. You made a mockery of our sacrifices." He paused, and the silence that followed was even worse. "You have chosen a fantasy over your family." The words cut deeper than any knife. He looked at his mother in the rearview mirror and saw that she was quietly crying, her face turned away from him. He had won the competition, he had won his future, but in that moment, sitting in the cold silence of the car, he felt like he had lost everything. The silence that followed him into the apartment was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the quiet of order, the one he had grown up with. This was a heavy, suffocating silence, a wall of anger and disappointment that separated him from his parents. He walked to his room, the certificate feeling like a lead weight in his hand, and closed the door. He didn't come out for dinner. A little while later, his mother knocked softly and left a plate of food on the floor outside his door. He didn't touch it. He just sat on his bed, the scholarship certificate on his desk, a symbol of his greatest victory and his deepest shame. He had won, but he felt like he had lost everything that mattered. The next few days were a blur of loneliness. He was grounded, not with words, but with the coldness in the house. His father barely looked at him. His mother would sometimes watch him with a sad, confused expression, but she would always look away when he caught her eye. The music was gone. He felt its absence like a missing limb. He would catch himself tapping a rhythm on his knee and would immediately stop, feeling a fresh wave of guilt. He tried to do his math homework to lose himself in the clean, logical world of numbers, but it was no use. The numbers were just dead symbols. The music was the thing that was alive, and he had killed it, or so it felt. Then, on the third day, something strange happened. He was lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling, when he heard a soft gasp from the living room. It was his mother. He heard the low murmur of the television, but not the usual news or cooking show. He heard his own name. He crept to his door and opened it just a crack, peering out into the hallway. His parents were on the sofa, staring at the television screen. On it was a younger version of himself walking onto a stage. It was a clip from the local news, the crew that had been covering the competition. The reporter's voice was full of excitement. And in a stunning upset, a relative unknown has taken the top prize at the Midwest Starlight competition. But the story isn't just about his win. It's about the raw, untutored genius of a young man who, we're told, taught himself in secret. The screen cut to a clip of his performance. He watched himself, saw the moment he closed his eyes and the music changed. He heard the roar of the applause. He looked over at his parents. His mother had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. But it was his father's face that shocked him. The anger was gone. In its place was a look of pure, unadulterated bewilderment. The news segment ended. But his father didn't turn off the TV. He picked up his phone and, after a moment of fumbling, pulled up the same clip on the internet. He watched it again. Then he watched it again. The boy retreated back into his room, his heart pounding. He didn't understand what was happening. The next morning, the silence in the apartment was still heavy, but it had changed. It was no longer just angry. It was thoughtful, confused. His father was already up, sitting in his armchair, but instead of his engineering textbook, he was holding his phone, scrolling through something with an intense focus. The boy walked quietly to the kitchen to get a glass of water, trying to be invisible. As he passed his father, he saw what was on the screen. It was a video of his performance, but this one had millions of views. The comments were scrolling by faster than he could read them. "Who is this kid?" This gave me goosebumps. That's not just playing. That's storytelling. He saw links to articles from music blogs and newspapers, all with headlines like "The Ghost of the Keys" and "A Prodigy in Our Midst." The world was indeed listening. His father looked up, and their eyes met for the first time since the car ride home. There was no anger in his father's gaze, only a deep, searching curiosity. "They are calling it a gift," his father said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. The boy didn't know what to say. He just stood there, holding his glass of water. His father looked back down at his phone, his thumb scrolling, reading more comments from people who didn't know him as a disobedient son, but as an artist. He saw comments from professional musicians, people who were amazed by his technique, his emotional depth. They didn't see a fantasy. They saw a rare and valuable talent. The boy's mother came into the room and stood behind her husband's chair, watching over his shoulder. She saw the comments, the headlines, the global reaction to her son's secret. She saw the joy on his face in the video, a raw, unbridled joy that she hadn't seen in him for years. A small tear rolled down her cheek, but this time, it wasn't a tear of sadness. That evening, the boy was in his room, pretending to read a book, when there was a soft knock on his door. It was his father. He opened the door slowly, bracing himself for another lecture. But his father wasn't holding a belt or a look of disappointment. He was holding his phone, his hand trembling slightly. He didn't say anything at first. He just held out the phone. On the screen was an email. The boy took the phone. It was from the admissions office of the Juilliard School in New York. They had seen the video. They were impressed. They wanted to schedule a meeting with him and their head of piano studies. They mentioned a special program for exceptional young talent. The boy read the email 3 times, his eyes not quite believing what they were seeing. Juilliard. It was a name from another universe. He looked up at his father, his mouth open, unable to speak. His father took the phone back, his eyes still fixed on the screen. "They are offering a meeting," he said, his voice thick with an emotion the boy couldn't quite name. A real school. A real future. He finally looked at his son, and the boy saw it in his eyes. The wall had crumbled. The fear was still there, the fear of the unknown, but it was now mixed with something else. A dawning understanding? A flicker of pride. I always thought a gift like this was a gamble, his father said, his voice barely audible. I saw it break your cousin. I saw it lead to nothing, but this is not nothing. He took a deep breath, and it was like he was letting go of a weight he had been carrying for 20 years. Maybe I was wrong about what kind of gift it is. It wasn't a big, dramatic apology. It was quiet, simple, and more powerful than any speech could have been. The boy felt a tightness in his chest loosen. A pain he hadn't even realized he was carrying began to fade away. His father gestured towards the living room. Your mother. She would like to hear you play, he said. If you want to. The boy nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He walked out of his room and into the small living room. His mother was sitting on the sofa, her eyes hopeful. His father stood by the window, his back to him, looking out into the night. There was no piano, but the boy knew what his father meant. He sat on the floor, closed his eyes, and placed his hands on his knees. He began to play, not on keys, but in his head. He played the piece from the competition, but this time it was different. It wasn't a cry of desperation or a shout of rebellion. It was a story of understanding, a bridge being built. Then his father turned from the window. He didn't say anything. He just walked over, sat down on the sofa next to his wife, and listened. The boy finished the silent song and opened his eyes. His father was looking at him, and in his eyes, the boy saw his future. It wasn't the straight, clean line to engineering anymore. It was a new path, a winding, uncertain, but beautiful path, and for the first time, he knew he wouldn't have to walk it alone. The music was no longer a secret to be hidden. It was the language that had finally brought them back together.